So let's pivot a little bit. In every section of this conversation, this is kind of an awkward transition, but it actually makes sense. Historicizing things. There's few public exercises more important than historically situating where we are. That helps give us a material view of reality, that helps us understand the velocity and trajectory of institutions and different patterns of politics and economics. And so history is a really important ground, and it's certainly a contested ground. The sort of fights about how we're going to process the past and, how we're going to understand where we came from and so on. But in, more recent years, and in this, piece that you've sent me, which is a review of a really fascinating new book called The Gig Economy and the Meritocracy Trap, you're talking about how what is a major labor story, which is this complete gutting out of the academy and the undermining of the academic job market, certainly in humanities and social sciences, also has really big public implications for basically the capacity to think publicly and understand who we are and where we came from, where we're going.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's actually connected to what's going on in terms of the outbreaks of rage and the unemployment crisis, because what's happened to American universities is that they've basically taken on features of the so-called gig economy. What is meant by the gig economy? The Amazon warehouse worker who isn't given enough hours to earn health care, the Uber driver, the subcontracted cafeteria worker. These are all people who have a general experience of precarity, which I do think is contributing to the rage that we're seeing throughout the United States on all sides of the political spectrum. So what's happened over the last 30 years, so there's actually a direct connection of precarity. And I think an experience of precarity really unites most American workers across collars, from blue to white collar to one could add the gigging journalist, right? And so one member of the gig economy is the adjunct professor, or the staff worker at part-time staff worker at universities, or the subcontracted cafeteria or maintenance worker at a university who basically works on contract. So just to give a little bit of background, in the last 30 years, the American system of higher education has undergone a process of neoliberal corporatization, where essentially jobs that were considered they were relatively stable in the past. For example, a professor, an administrative assistant to the dean or what have you, or a maintenance worker or a janitor at a university, jobs that were pretty much relatively stable have been adjunctified or precariatized. As university administrators, informed by a neoliberal ideology, have sought to cut costs at the expense of pretty much everything else. So, for example, roughly 75% of professors in American universities are not what are considered tenure track professors. There's no way to get tenure that is a permanent job. And that's problematic because when you have tenure, you're able to be controversial, like, for example, I am on Twitter, and more importantly, teach controversial topics or research controversial topics without fear of being fired. So what's happened now in university systems is that basically everyone is precarious. So why does this matter? It matters first and foremost because study after study has demonstrated that precarious professors, precarious staff members, precarious university workers are not able to develop the types of relationships that they've traditionally been able to develop with students, which leads to just negative student outcomes. Fewer people graduate from college, fewer people are able to transfer from 2 to 4 year universities. There's a rise in student depression. There's a decline in student achievement, generally speaking, because learning, as we all know, is social. And if you're not able to develop social relationships, if professors aren't able to develop social relationships with their students, students suffer. So first and foremost, as college ironically has increased in price, and as students have taken out tens of thousands of dollars in debt to attend college, the university educations have actually gotten worse because more workers are precarious. So that's one. And two, what is really important to me as someone who's dedicated themselves to research, and I'm sure to many people who are listening who care about things like history, right? Historicization is a very important political act. It helps us denaturalize the past. I mean, it helps us denaturalize the present and see that there are other alternatives, is that you just are seeing a decline in knowledge production. So histories that would have been written in the past are just not being written because when you're an adjunct professor, you get paid $3,000 a class and you're working at 6 different universities to make whatever $20,000 a year. You're not really able to devote yourself to research and the production of new knowledge. And this is especially true in the humanities and social sciences, but it is also true in the sciences. And it basically just leads to a terrible life. So one of my good friends, a guy named David Parsons, who actually hosts an excellent podcast called The Nostalgia Trap, I recommend everyone listen to it. He was just fired at no notice in the autumn. He works for the California State University system, and he just received an email saying, sorry, enrollments are down, you're fired. So he's out of a job, and he's not going to be able to do anything to basically make an income. And this experience is paradigmatic of people throughout the gig economy and the gig academy. So it's paradigmatic of the gig academy, which is reflective of the larger gig economy. So I just wanted to highlight this because I do think the American university system is about to face an apocalypse. COVID-19 is going to slash states' budgets, which have already been slashed in the last 20, 30 years, particularly after the 2008 crisis. And perhaps even more importantly, it's going to prevent a lot of foreign students from enrolling at American universities. So what happened after the 2008 crisis is that in order to make up for budget shortfalls by the state, universities switched to enrolling more foreign students because, frankly, they pay more for higher education. But if these people aren't going to be able to come back to the United States, either because Trump does something, as seems to be happening today, or because they're afraid of contracting COVID-19, or if they're afraid of racism and xenophobia, the American university system is going to experience a serious budget shortfall. So I'm just emphasizing this because if people care about education, they care about history, they care about the production of new knowledge, we need to basically all come together and persuade our fellow Americans and also state legislators about the importance of university education, both because it's the right thing to do and both because we want to be a society that has a history.
How can we track this incredible paradox that there used to be much more of an understanding in, say, the kind of post-World War II through the 60s, that education was in some sense a public good, that people from different class backgrounds should have access, going to college shouldn't be prohibitive there. And at the same time, there was certainly, much clearer doorways into the middle class or the professional class, if you had that capacity, in terms of, if you could make it through law school, you're probably going to get a good job. Now, of course, there's all sorts of other factors that play in, and nepotism and social networks and everything else. Absolutely. But there was this funny paradox where it wasn't, there was a lot less of an ideology of education needing to have a specific economic output, even as it did have an economic output. In the last several decades, it's turned into just a calling card and a brand, even as the power of that brand has diminished significantly in terms of what it will actually buy you in employment opportunities and income in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I'll try to keep this brief. So in the last 3 decades, I think that shift is due to the rise of neoliberal ideology, and that's reflected in a variety of ways. Perhaps most importantly, you begin to see things like the board of regents of university boards of regents throughout the country, instead of consisting of sort of community leaders and most importantly, retired academics, you begin to see like corporate leaders move into boards of regents. And with that happening, you begin to see the imposition of a corporate logic onto the American university system, which is, at least in its ideal form, and wasn't really a business, but it starts to be treated like a business. Universities become obsessed, for example, with maintaining control of patents that are created on their system. Famously, Google was founded by 2 Stanford University graduates, and Stanford didn't on Stanford equipment, and Stanford didn't get anything. And so there's that sort of anxiety about getting the product of your research. But what's also interesting is I think that we can't, unfortunately, separate the explosion of higher education in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s from the Cold War. So on one hand, a deal was essentially made between the government and white soldiers in the United States, where because they fought for their war, because they fought World War II, they were going to be able to get a higher degree, and that would have been an engine for social mobility. But also crucially, the American government begins to really fund the higher education system in 1958. Why? What happens in 1957? The Soviets launch Sputnik, the first satellite in space. And so that fear of Sputnik basically freaks out the American government, and they begin to pour millions of dollars into American university systems, basically to ensure that we have a scientifically educated populace. So there's always been, at least in the moment of its greatest explosion, the American university system has always been informed by a security logic. And perhaps, unfortunately, you see that happening today, right? I'm reading a book right now for a future review, and the argument made for higher education is that if we want to compete with China, we need to have a highly educated populace. So what I'm hoping to do, right, exactly.
And the same day, there's legislation from Cotton and Blackburn, just this kind of most rank, embarrassing xenophobia about blocking Chinese graduate students from STEM.
Exactly. So just to wrap up, what I'm curious about is whether it's possible in this country to have a funding of higher education that's not directly linked to security, to national security logics. We haven't had it really, and I hope we can, but I'm a little bit pessimistic.
How would this relate then? I mean, there's having a bigger public argument, which is really important, but I think is obviously going to be very hard because obviously we're in a depression. There's another wave of austerity. All sorts of immediate material needs are under attack. And then, other than a kind of broad public argument, which is important, what's the sort of concrete mechanism? Like you occasionally hear, and I think one of the actual elements of this precarity economy is sort of, all right, well, I mean, these workers are on strike. Great. Maybe we can, at least, talk about these McDonald's workers or give them some attention, or maybe, or obviously if you have the capacity and there's a GoFundMe that's real, you can donate to a strike fund. These things are concrete and important and tangible, but that hasn't been sort of systematized yet.
No, I think that's exactly. Yeah, I do think there's two things, and I just want to highlight a lot of the information I'm talking about comes from this excellent book called The Gig Academy by Kazar, Scott, and DePaula. So if anyone wants more details, please check that book out. But I think essentially that there are two ways to do it. One, within the American university, professors for the first time in U.S. history share a work experience that is far more similar to staff and subcontracted maintenance and cafeteria workers and the like than they ever have before. So within universities themselves, you can't limit things like unionization just to professors, but you have to take all jobs together. And I think that's actually true across the economy. Sectoral. Again, the life of sector. I think it's called cross-occupation organizing when you're doing it within an industry, and then also cross-sectoral organizing in the sense that the life of an adjunct professor is much more similar to an Amazon worker than not. So I think that, again, you need the sort of within the university cross-occupational organizing, and then without the university cross-sectoral organizing. And this is actually really important, I think, question for organizing theorists, is that in the absence of the factory, right, the single location where people go to day after day and form social bonds and form communities, nowadays you have like the Uber driver who's totally alienated and doesn't know her or his fellow colleagues, right? So how do you basically get workers to have consciousness of the shared experience of precarity both within and without their industry? Because I personally think this is a shared experience across the American political economy that we need to be centering as a left. Now, that's a really difficult question, but I think that's the only way that we're going to get any sort of transformation. I think if you, for example, just unionize union workers or just unionize adjunct professors, that you might get short victories or short-term victories, but you won't get the sort of transformational victory in the political economy that we actually need. It's a really difficult question. I don't have an answer, but I think those are two meaningful strategies, and the authors of the Gig Academy talk about both at more length.
I actually asked President Lula about that when I interviewed him, because he was talking a lot about, since he was released from political imprisonment, one of the things he talked about in one of his first rally speeches was actually the Uberization of Brazil and how that was related to, attacks on unions and pensioners. And, he definitely, he had some very important and visceral instincts, as he would, about, he had this image that he painted of, like, somebody's like, it's pouring rain and they're on a scooter and they're like delivering your pizza, essentially, and they have no foundation and no respect from the government, no bonds, and essentially, like, that's like the new person. Like, if people should watch the interview, but like that needs to be the kind of center of the decision making and policy making today. But it also was definitely, it's tricky because just even physically, the foundations of, you don't want to idolize like being a metal worker or something. It's not fun, but you're hundreds of people, you're in the same spot. You're also not as totally surveilled as you are in an Amazon warehouse today, where your every micro movement is being processed and a terror. I mean, this is one of the reasons that, the Amazon has a higher rate of injuries on the job, because every step is quantified to maximize efficiency. So yeah, these are definitely
which is
the
just
barriers.
sort of exactly, and that's an upshot of sort of Taylorist management strategy of the early 20th century, where he was literally, measuring movements in order to try to get, the most efficient thing. And I think when we look back on it, even in 5-10 years time, we'll see that one of the things that neoliberal economic practices did was that they destroyed social bonds. And those are, of course, social bonds, community bonds are one of the foundations of solidarity. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to overcome a political economy that is clearly not benefiting the overwhelming majority of not only Americans, but people in the world, is that these social connections are just totally destroyed. Started with deindustrialization, is now basically reached its apotheosis, where the algorithm is determining who gets what and who is employed, right? Another interesting thing I just want to mention is that this has actually come along with the destruction of middle management, right? You don't need middle managers anymore. Algorithms have essentially replaced middle managers. So it's important because this is an experience that is not just traditional blue collar, it is also traditional white collar, right? And it really, and you see that by the fact that I just mentioned that Amazon warehouse workers and adjunct professors, people with PhDs, share a lot more in common than they did ever before in American history. And so this is, I think, a really crucial thing to center, as Lula said, now and going forward until we, reach a post-capitalist society.
Well, Daniel Bessner, appreciate your time as always. Everybody check out Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer, The Rise of Defense Intellectuals, which actually, as you can see in the course of this conversation, can give us some insight on this situation as well. And of course, you can follow Daniel on Twitter and, read his writing and in all the places that you would expect to see writing like this. So Daniel Bessner, thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. Take it easy. Bye.
Take care. Bye.